Hello, good evening. Welcome. So tonight, happy new moon in Leo, by the way. And because it's such a thing, and this is one of the books that we're reading right now, I'm going to go back into The Moon-Eyed People, Folk Tales from Welsh America by Peter Stevenson. So yeah, lots of crazy pronunciations in here that yeah. So here we go. Chapter 4, Lone Man Coyote. A finger followed the lines of sepia ink that marked the division between land and sea on a map of the known world. It traced around the contour thumbprints. It rested on the tops of mountains. It touched the stitches on the patchwork quilt landscape, then swam down a river that flowed like blue blood to the sea. Out there were scaly serpents with spines and whiptails, giant squid that could squeeze the life out of a person, predatory mermaids who plied sailors with gin and dragged them down into the depths, and black-bearded pirates who would tear you limb from limb and feed your remains to the seagulls. The map was a mirror. Reflections stared back through the ripples in the water, and peered over his shoulders were wraiths dressed in cottons and woolens, eyes bulging, fish mouths moving silently. They were speaking, pleading, beckoning. He had decided to leave this scarred land torn apart by civil war. He was no soldier. He was the illegitimate son of a dead prince, weary of his half-brothers squabbling over who should rule. He had read Tellyson's description of a magic country beyond the looking glass of the sea, and knew the stories told by the sailors who visited the green fields of enchantment that lay beyond the horizon. He built a ship out of trees from the forests of Eryri, held together with nails made from stag's horn. He resolved to build a new Gwyneth in a new world. Gwyneth in a new world. He had followers, and they were visionaries and dreamers. Some called them mad dogs. Hey, CV. Hey, Miss Six. Welcome, everyone. He left Rose-on-Sea in 1170, and there is a plaque in the garden of a rambling old house built on the spot from where he sailed. How long his journey took, how many monsters he met on the way, how many mermaids he drank beer with, how many friends died for his dreams, there is no memory now. But he landed in Utopia, now known as Mobile Bay, Alabama, where there is another plaque to commemorate him. Then, like all good tourists, he took an excursion and followed the Mississippi north to the Missouri and the Ohio Falls, where he built stone houses on the Georgia and North Carolina border. And there is yet another plaque, although this one does not mention him by name, for he had vanished into the wilderness, a wise move for a Welshman who was about to become a legend. His name was Madog ap Owain Gwyneth, and his story was written by Willem of Flanders in the mid-1200s, although no copies of this man's book survive. Perhaps he was a historian, or a hack journalist, or a novelist who invented the whole fairy tale. 300 years later, the British king decided, for his own political machinations, that a British man, note Mad Dog was no longer a Welshman, had landed in America before that Spaniard who had butchered so many native people. In 1584, David Powell included the folktale in his History of Cambria, so giving the story an historical truth. Excuse me. After 200 years had passed, there was talk of a tribe of Welsh Indians, or Numakuki, the Mandan, descendants of the first Welsh settlers in America. Here were romance and dreams for those who peered westwards from the gray mists of Dyfed towards an idealized past. Mad Dog was now living in a world of fairy tale and mythology, so who better to enter this story than Edward Williams of Glamorgan? Iolo Morganug, self-styled rattle skull genius, founder of the Gorseth, writer of medieval manuscripts, albeit in the late 1700s, laudanum addict, folklorist, flautist, collector of folk tales and tunes, political radical, fair trade shopkeeper, and abolitionist who refused to deal with anyone involved in slavery, including his plantation owner brothers. Hey, Mr. Hugh, thank you. Welcome in. Iolo was an explorer of the mind who rationalized that if a Welshman really had landed in America back in the 12th century, he could help forge a strong national identity for the oppressed motherland. So he organized an expedition to search for Mad Dog's mythical native descendants. He recruited a younger and fitter man, John Evans, son of a Methodist preacher from Ch.4 in Gwynedd. Iolo dug deep into his savings and bought John an economy class ticket on a far from luxurious sailing ship. He landed groggily in Baltimore in 1792 and wrote to Iolo, saying it was the Maddogian or sick or death. Iolo had given him $1.75 and a letter of recommendation to a bookseller in Philadelphia that praised John as a virtuous and honest man, and made it quite clear that he was acting without the consent of any government or authority, or indeed anyone but Iolo himself. John worked in Philadelphia for a year, then set off across the endless ridges of the Allegheny Mountains, over 300 miles, until he came to the Welsh steel and coal town of Pittsburgh, little more than a fort back then, where three mighty rivers met: the Allegheny, the Ohio, and the Monongahela. As John Evans stood at the confluence, the waters lapped over his boots and presented him with a choice: which river to follow. He had followed the Monongahela. Okay, had he followed the Monongahela, his story might have been considerably shorter, for he would have found the Morgans of West Virginia and the moon-eyed Welsh, who were living in the mountains of Appalachia. However, he followed the Ohio south to St. Louis, where he was promptly imprisoned by the Spanish rulers on suspicion of being a British spy, intent on discrediting Columbus, which in a sense he was. He negotiated his release in return for promising to map the trail across the Rockies westward to the Pacific Ocean. It's juicy. In 1795, now in the employ of the Spanish, John and 30 men set off north along the Missouri, following the trail thought to have been taken by the first settlers. He stayed with the Omaha and spent the winter hunting buffalo on the freezing plains. When spring came, he rode further north, was attacked by the Lakota, and fled back to the safety of the Omaha. Once recovered, he set off again until he was over 1,000 miles from St. Louis, 5,000 miles from Ch.4, almost at the Canadian border. And it was here that John Evans found the Numakuki, the Mandan. He knew this because a Union Jack was flying over their village, left there by a Canadian fur trader named Rene Jasami. He tore down the offending flag and hoisted the Spanish colors. He was welcomed by the Mandan and spent the winter studying their speech for linguistic traces of Welsh. At first, there was excitement, followed slowly by disillusion. Come spring, Jasami returned and threatened to kill him, so John Evans left the Mandan forever. He returned to St. Louis and reported to the leaders of the Welsh Society in Philadelphia. Quote, "In respect of the Welsh Indians, I have only to inform you that I could not meet with such a people, and from intercourse I have had with Indians from latitude 35 to 49, I think you may with safety inform our friends that they have no existence." End quote. He wrote to Iolo saying there was no Welsh Indians. He took to drinking in taverns and hostelries, hostelries, to taverns and hostelries, where his wallet was bottomless. One of his companions reported that, in fact, he really had found the Welsh Indians and had been paid handsomely by the Spanish government of New Orleans to keep his mouth shut in order to protect Columbus's reputation. Sadly, his newfound wealth did little for John Evans, and after his house flooded, he became susceptible to local viruses and died in New Orleans, aged 29. Damn, Bean. But the fairy tale did not end with poor John. In 1804, Welsh-speaking President Thomas Jefferson... Wow! Thomas Jefferson spoke Welsh? What? Wow! What a thing! Okay. But the fairy tale did not end with poor John. In 1804, Welsh-speaking President Thomas Jefferson funded an expedition to explore a trail to the west coast, led by frontiersman and slaveholder William Clark and Weriwether Lewis, a Virginian politician and soldier of Welsh descent. Their guide was Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who spoke many native languages and acted as translator. She had been purchased by a fur trader named Toussaint Charbonnet, and on the route she bore their young son, Baptiste. Sacagawea negotiated a safe passage through the Lakota lands to the Mandan in North Dakota, where she met Rene Jasami, the fur trader who had chased away John Evans. She guided the expedition safely through the Rockies to the Pacific, and once again there were whispers of native Welsh people. In 1832, George Catlin, showman and artist, also visited the Mandan. One of Catlin's paintings showed the Numakuki village with roundhouses rather than teepees, while another was of women fishing from boats that he described as tubs they carried on their shoulders to the river, propelled by inserting a paddle into the water in front of her and drawing it towards them. It looked to Welsh eyes suspiciously like a coracle. Tongues wagged even more. Catlin noted that shortly after his encounter with the Numakuki, a steamboat from St. Louis brought traders with smallpox that infected the whole nation and killed many people. The survivors joined with the Hidatsa and Arikara. The blood mingled. Their stories survived too, with tantalizing tales of lone man and themes from Welsh mythology. False. All right. And then there's a little pause here. And then we go into, I think, this story. When the corn was ripe, Lone Man was traveling the world from swamp to swamp. When he saw Raven flying over his head, he sang to Raven, "Where do I come from? How did I come to be here? Where am I going?" Raven told him to return to the last swamp he had visited, and he would find answers. When he went back to the swamp, all he found were weeds. The weed mother spoke. "I am your mother. I am just a weed. Boil my children up for food and medicine, then go into the world and heal your brothers and sisters." So Lone Man did as the weed mother had said, and he walked on until he met a sister, who he offered to heal. She said she didn't need healing, that she could heal him, and they argued over who was the oldest and wisest. They lay down and agreed that the one who stayed there the longest would be the wisest. Time passed, and Lone Man looked at his sister and saw she was covered in weeds, for all the world as if she was growing back into the earth, as dead as the autumn leaves. So he stood up. And then his sister stood up, brushed the weeds from her clothes, shook the flowers from her hair, and said, "See, I told you I was the wisest." They smoked a pipe, and took Mother Weed's herbs and made a world. They took 2 mud hens from the swamp and threw them in the air and made a woodpecker, who dipped her head into a red flower and so became the first red-headed woodpecker. They threw more mud into the air and made a nighthawk, the first owl, and then they rolled the rest of the mud into balls and rolled them into the plains and made the buffalo, and so the animals multiplied. Old Grandmother Frog complained, "You're making too many animals. You need to be rid of some." So they hit Granny Frog with a hot stone, and she became the first creature to die. But old Granny was not finished. She came back and told them death wasn't such a good idea after all. But they said it was too late. Death was here to stay. Having created this perfect world, Lone Man and his sister had nothing left to do. He became bored, so Weed Mother played a trick on him. She turned him into an old trickster coyote, and from that day he never knew where he came from. Coyote came to a village where everyone was thin, yet there were piles of buffalo meat. The people told him that whenever they hunted, Raven flew overhead. But this was no ordinary raven. It had the head of a bald man and the body of a long-necked bird, and when it squawked, "Gibba, gibba," their meat turned sour. They pleaded with Coyote for help, and Coyote explained they were killing too many buffalo, and that Raven was telling them that if they continued in that way, their world would end. So he called for friend Spider, and they smoked their pipes round a fire and hatched a plan. Spider spun a web across the hole in a tree, in an old tree where Raven lived, and when the bird emerged, Coyote caught him and flew him into the fire. As he crushed the unburned bones, out flew small white ravens, as white as Branwen in the old Welsh story. And as they flew away, they sang to the people, saying they would only return at the end of the world, or when fewer buffalo were hunted. And the people listened to the song of the birds. If only Lone Man John Evans had listened to the birds when he was standing at the confluence of the 3 rivers in Pittsburgh, if he had understood then that there were no Welsh Indians, he might not have followed the Ohio to St. Louis, but traveled down the Monongahela River into Appalachia, where he would have found Cherokee and Shawnee with Welsh ancestry, who lived alongside the Moon-Eyed people, who had moved into their land to dig for coal, preach religion, fight, and make peace. He would have heard the Welsh language spoken, along with the native Salagi and Algonquin, at least until the people were forcibly moved from Appalachia to Oklahoma. And John Evans would probably have lived a much longer life in the mountain state, where one old granny remarried at 98, although her husband died 6 months later, because he couldn't keep up with her. Oh my goodness. That was the Lone Man Coyote. Chapter 5, The Bohemian Consul to Cardiff. And here's the picture. So the Bohemian Consul to Cardiff. In the Huntsman's Rest Inn at Peterstone's Super Ely, near Cardiff, sat a group of humble folk one afternoon, when I chanced to stop there to rest myself by the chimney side, after a long walk through green lanes. The men were drinking their tankards of ale and smoking their long clay pipes. They were talking about their dogs and horses, the crops, the hard times, and the prospect of bettering themselves by emigration to America. On this latter theme, I was able to make myself interesting, and acquaintance was thereupon easily established on a friendly footing. I led the conversation into the domain of folklore, and this book is richer in illustration on many a page in consequence. And that's by Wirt Sykes, 1880. His name is Wirt, W-I-R-T. Sykes, S-I-K-E-S. Wirt Sykes. What a name. The humble folk who were smoking clay pipes and drinking foaming ale from tankards outside what is now the Sportsman Rest saw him coming. He was an elegant man, in his 40s, with a goatee beard and flowing Buffalo Bill hair, dressed in a long black coat, and carrying a cane with a fox head handle. The stranger greeted them in a cheerful manner, and they worked out pretty quickly that he wasn't from Cardiff. He was American, and he looked friendly, and therefore there was every chance of a free pint if they sang Arlan Imor, or told him about the fairies. They invited him to sit down, and he introduced himself as Mr. Sykes, and they said they were Di, Tim, and Wyndham. Where are you from? Question mark. Actually, it's where are you from, comma, BWT. Oh, Bout. Where are you from, Bout? Well, I'm from New York State, replied Mr. Sykes. Do, muttered Di. New York? Asked Tim. These spellings are pretty interesting. Quote, they have tall buildings there. Go right up to the clouds, said Wynne. I would go there myself, if I only had the money. So Mr. Sykes explained that he was from upstate, but he told them all about New York City, and they all agreed that they would go there if only they had the money. But they barely had enough to buy a beer, and their families would want to come too, and they drained their glasses quickly and waited until Mr. Sykes offered to fill them up. Being a polite and generous man with a love of the humble people, Mr. Sykes obliged and bought a freshly squeezed lemonade for himself. They asked him what his business was in this part of the world, and he explained. Well, I have come to Cymru to live and work. President Ulysses S. Grant has appointed me as American Consul to Cardiff, so I am engaging people in conversation in order to understand this picturesque and sublime land. I'm particularly interested in fairy tales. Do you gentlemen by any chance know of any? The men from the Sportsman's eyed each other with that shared knowledge that they were in for an evening of free beer, perhaps even a whiskey, maybe a double. Quote, Wyndham, tell the gentleman a story, said Di and Tim together. Wyndham downed his glass. Mr. Sykes bought him another, and he began. There was an old couple living on a farm on the road to St. Fagans, or Fagans. So he was called Roly Pug. Pug? And, okay, so let's try that all again, okay? So there was an old couple lived on a farm on the road to St. Fagans. He was called Roly Pugh, and she was Caddy Jones. They'd never married, but they shared a bed as if they were, and they were known for their bad luck. Caddy had a weak chest. Roly's back ached. Their crops withered. The roof leaked. The house was damp. Their noses dripped. They had no money and nothing to laugh at all. Their fortune was so bad, they decided to sell the farm and go to America. That evening, and... oh, man. Okay, so double L is that... Sean. A shot. Man. A Shaw. That evening, and a Shaw. That's, oh gosh. Hey, buddy. Hey, Secret Soul, welcome in. Dude, it's Ellyyll, which would much easier for me to pronounce Ellil, which I think I'll probably do. Oh no. But it's, I think actually it's that that sound appeared that evening, and Ellil appeared. It spoke in the darkness and told them to light a candle before they went to bed, and all would be well. Then it kicked up its heels and vanished. and all they saw was a shadowy figure disappearing into the night. Okay, so they're just going to America. Okay. That night, Caddy placed a candle by the bed and left it alight. In the morning, she woke up to the smell of fresh bread and a blazing fire. Tools were cleaned and sharpened. Clothes and sheets were washed and starched. Caddy left the candle alight every night, and soon their crops were blooming. The cattle were content, the pigs fat. Even their noses stopped dripping. This went on for 3 years until one night, while Rolly snored, Caddy took it in her head to thank the Elil. She stayed awake, and when he appeared, she watched him dancing around the candle. He looked funny, with his long pipe cleaner arms and legs. Caddy giggled, almost imperceptibly, just to herself, but he heard her, and vanished. From that day, Rolly and Caddy had to do their own baking and washing and cleaning, but they managed the farm well. They brewed their own beer and opened a fine alehouse at Peterson's Super Ellie. So there you are, you see. There was no need to discover America after all. And wouldn't that have saved a whole lot of trouble? Wyndham sat back and sipped his beer, while Di and Tim nodded in approval and muttered words of agreement. Mr. Sykes wondered whether that last remark was aimed at him, but he laughed, for he agreed with these stout-hearted working men, and he disliked many of his own countrymen, particularly his president. Not that he considered himself prejudiced, heaven forbid, or heaven forfend, but he did disapprove of drunkenness, although he understood that liquor was lifeblood to the laboring man, and it would be judicious to buy them another. What did they call it here? Another round. And this time the boys persuaded him to have a pint of Welsh crew rather than lemonade. Kuru. Against his teetotalitarian beliefs. And they told him tales all about the flitting of the puka, of the Tarwin, puka, of the Trin, and knocking of the Coblinow, and knocking of the Coblinow of the mines, the Bubak and the preacher, the story of Guto Bach and the fairy money, and the one about the lady of the Carmarthenshire Lake that was in all the books. They invited him to drink up, and they would tell him another one. After several hours, Mr. Sykes wobbled the few miles home to his house in Cardiff, having drunk rather more than he was used to. Well, he wasn't used to any beer, and he remembered he didn't really approve of drinking, and certainly not to excess. But he was studying the customs and traditions of the native people, so he had to impress his informants that he was of the same social standing as they were. And anyway, the Welsh were a delight compared with the Germans. Not that he judged people on the country they were born in. Perish the thought. But he had once written, quote, German drunkards are seldom noisy and demonstrative, and for this reason they do not figure so largely in the police reports as other nationalities do. But they drink like hogs and bloat most disgustingly, and are generally half stupefied with the vile swill they swallow in gallons. A sleepy, piggish sot is a less dangerous animal to society than a furious, whiskey demonizing brute, at least. Angel Fish, welcome in. Awesome. I know. I find Welsh to be so interesting too. That double L noise, I didn't practice it more. I'm sure nobody can tell, especially if they're Welsh. It's sort of a loogie noise, but it's also delicate. So what? And he made a mental note not to discuss this in polite society. Wirt Sykes had already led an interesting and eventful long life before he came to Wales. He was born in Watertown, Jefferson County, New York, in 1836, seventh of 11 children, 5 of whom died young. His father, William, was a doctor who insisted his son be home educated following a childhood illness that left him partly deaf. His individual schooling gave him the idea that he could do whatever he wanted. So when he grew, he decided to lead the Bohemian life of a writer, radical, and social reformer. At the age of 19, he remarried Jeanette Annie Wilcox, and within a couple of years, he was the father of two children, George and Clara. He felt it imperative to earn a living to keep his family, so he took a job as a typesetter and reporter for the Utica Morning Herald. All the while he was writing, and soon he published his first book of stories and poems, a book for the Winter Evening Fireside. I think that's its title. It was favorably received, but words did not feed his family, so in 1862 they moved to Chicago, where he was employed as inspector of canals for the state-owned Illinois and Michigan Canal Company. His ambition was to cultivate a name for himself as a free-thinking radical writer and newspaperman, and there was nothing bohemian about inspecting canals. And he needed to be free, not perpetually worried about money. So he and Jeanette separated, and he moved to New York City, where he found work writing for Harper's Magazine, Scribner's Monthly, Appleton's Journal, The Youth's Companion, and Oliver Optic's Magazine. He specialized in social justice and equality, supported women's rights, rallied against poverty and poor housing, and preached passionately against the demon drink. In 1869, he wrote, quote, "One Poor Girl, the Story of Thousands," end quote, the tale of a girl who leaves the rural idyll of upstate New York to find herself in the Big Apple, where she falls into drink and prostitution until she is saved by a dark stranger who bears more than a striking resemblance to none other than Mr. Wirt Sykes himself. He was nothing if not prolific, and used as many as 30 pseudonyms. He was rather fond of Burton Sachs, author of the dime novel The Black Hunter. However, despite his ability to produce an extraordinary amount of work, reviewers weren't particularly kind. The New York Tribune wrote that there were grades of literati in the city, with writers such as Thackeray at the top, perhaps, and descending, as the editors expressed it, down to Wirt Sykes. Mark Twain described him as a small salaried minor journalist. Wow. Why would Mark Twain say something like that? Maybe, I mean, maybe it's true, but I just am saying, it seems so belittling. A small salaried minor journalist. In 1873, he married the actress, writer, and women's rights activist Olive Logan, and they caused a stir with their criticism of President Ulysses S. Grant for doing nothing to improve the housing conditions of the urban poor, having no interest in supporting a social healthcare system, yet all the while watching on while the rich became richer. However, Mr. Sykes was prolific and loud enough to be heard by those in high places, so President Grant took Wirt's father to one side and asked if anything could be done about the damnable boy. A plan was devised to send him overseas, somewhere small and insignificant that no one had ever heard of, where he couldn't get into any mischief, preferably a long way from America. So he was appointed American Consul to Wales and informed he was being sent to Cardiff. Mr. Sykes knew next to nothing about Wales, wasn't even sure where it was, and like many before him, assumed it was part of England. He spent time deep in research in the Library of Congress, but found only a travel diary and a map. Undaunted, he and Olive started packing, and on 7 June 1876, they arrived in Cardiff docks. He approached his new job with his usual speed and diligence, and produced a detailed annual report on the future markets for imported American canned food, which was well liked in 19th century Cardiff, although Mr. Sykes developed a taste for fresh Welsh lamb, which he declared to be the best in the world. He participated in civic events, laid the foundation stone for the new Cardiff Public Library in 1880 and appeared frequently in the local newspapers discussing trade connections between America and Wales. He spoke out against shipping companies who were doing little to improve the poor conditions that seamen endured, and soon he was railing against industrial poverty, supporting social care, and condemning those who lived only for economic prosperity. The old radical Sykes was back. There was plenty in Cardiff to occupy him, and he was sufficiently far away from Washington that the president could turn a deaf ear. At least until Mr. Sykes' assistant in the American embassy complained to the U.S. State Department that the consul was not an easy man to work for, being difficult to find when papers required his signature, and prone to taking extended leaves of absence without informing his staff where he was going and leaving no way of contacting him. Sykes was indulging himself in two of his passions, walking and writing. He was wandering the old Welsh trampling roads like many a visitor to Wales before him, and writing magazine articles about his adventures and observations in the byways of South Wales, particularly along his favorite rivers, the Wye and the Usk or Usk. He walked around the wild Welsh coast, visited watering places, and breathed in the sea air. Wirt and Wales went together like socks and boots. By 1880, his staff knew exactly what the rogue consul had been up to. Only 3 years after he arrived in Wales, he published a book, British Goblins, Welsh Folklore, Fairy Mythology, Legends, and Traditions. The goblins of the title were anything but British. This was a collection of Welsh folk tales and folklore, gathered in the best of ways, from searching archives and walking the roads chatting with people. Presumably, his publisher, Sampson Low, had told him that Welsh goblins couldn't sell enough copies, but they could hear dollars in tales of the British fairy folk. Here were stories of old-time Welsh fairyland, basilisks, and fire fiends, birds of enchantment, exorcism by knife, the flying fairies of Bedwellty, the Green Lady of Caerphilly, cheese and the didactic purpose in Welsh folklore, the cruel creed of ignorance regarding changelings, balls, prevention of fairy kidnapping, and the theory of hiding druids. Okay, get a sip. That might help. Mr. Sykes loved to make sense out of chaos. He categorized his goblins. So the bubach is usually brown, often hairy, and the coblinow are black or copper-colored in face as well as dress. He divided them neatly and with certainty into 5 classes. So this one is the elves, but it's that ELLYLLON, or elves, that's 1. 2, the coblinow, or mine fairies. 3, the bubachad, or household fairies. 4, the Gurugeth, the Gurugeth Anun, or fairies of the lakes or streams. And 5, the Gwishan, or mountain fairies. And he noted the parallels between Welsh folklore and American. So Bonfire Night was equivalent to the 4th of July, Welsh ghost stories to American spiritualism, and Snowdonia reminded him of Colorado. He loved the castles, the Welsh spirit, and he took too much delight in discussing the longevity and virtuousness of Welsh women, particularly the, quote, gigantic women of Carmarthenshire. He described Owain Glyndwr as a medieval Buffalo Bill crossed on a Carolina freebooter. A medieval Buffalo Bill crossed on a Carolina freebooter. Despite his radicalism, Wirt Sykes was an old romantic who lived in an entirely idealized Jenny Jones, Wales. He befriended the Cardiff-based illustrator T.H. Thomas, who provided sketches for many of his books and articles, including his iconic Rambles and Studies in Old South Wales. Tom Thomas was way more than an illustrator. He was a geologist, a naturalist, a painter, traveler, explorer, member of the Cambrian Academy for Art, and champion of Welsh artists, whose house was a center for intellectual meetings. However, despite his Bohemian friends and radical opinions, Mr. Sykes never quite managed to leave behind his lifelong campaign against drink. Although his views were tempered when it came to Welsh beer, thanks in no small part to the humble folk he encountered while he was walking the land, however, he did have a tendency to stereotype. When an Englishman is drunk, he is belligerent. When a Frenchman is drunk, he is amorous. When an Italian is drunk, he is loquacious. When a Scotchman is drunk, he is argumentative. When a German is drunk, he is sleepy. When an American is drunk, he brags. And when a Welshman is drunk, he sings. Ha 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 ha. Sykes passed over to the Goblin world in 1883, aged only 46, and it was hard to believe that he had only lived in Wales for 6 years, given his prolific writing and research. Olive remarried to her secretary, James O'Neill, and vanished from public life. Until one day, an old woman dressed in black and carrying an ear trumpet walked into a police station and charged O'Neill, then a watchman on Ellis Island, with drunkenness and non-support. Her old friend her old friend Tennessee Claflin heard about Olive's destitution and brought her to London, where she was cared for until, suffering from dementia, she died in 1909 in Banstead Asylum. Wirt Sykes left behind one story in British Goblins that would easily have been about himself. What happened to his kids this whole time? Ch.4 lived near Aberystwyth in a crumbling cottage close to the muddy banks of the river. She was 17, tall and gangly, soft-spoken, with skin of ivory and eyes of dark velvet that could never make contact with another. She tied buttercups and dandelions in her mane of jet black hair, chased butterflies till they fell from the sky, played with lizards till their tails dropped off, outstared hares till they turned into witches, and frequently broke things. She hugged the neighbor's cat so lovingly she suffocated it, though she said sorry several times to its lifeless corpse. Oh, geez. Ch.4 worked as a cowgirl on her mother's farm, for cows were too big for her to break. She walked barefoot to feel the cowpats squelch between her toes, but she was easily distracted. One night she returned home late, having forgotten her cows, only to meet her mother's sharp tongue. Ch.4 explained that she had been with the Tylwyth Teg, who danced around her in a ring, playing tiny harps and fiddles, dressed in red patchwork clothes. The women with shaggy red hair. The woman with shaggy red hair. The men with straggly orange beards. And they spoke a language too beautiful for mere words. Her mother rolled her eyes, but never chided her child for fear of offending the other world. Instead, she stroked Ch.4's hair and kissed her gently. Time passed, and Ch.4 came home late more and more, until one night she never returned. Her mother searched the woods and the streams and kept watch on the Tir nos Ysbrydion, the nights when the veil between the world and the other world were at their thinnest. She watched the coombe where the fair folk rode white horses, the lake where the red-haired lady tended her snow-white cattle, and the cave where the dark souls lived. A week passed and Shui had not returned. People searched everywhere for her. Police nailed posters to trees, and ponds were dredged. Her mother consulted the two brothers who lived at the Y Fairwig, who were able to find the lost and confused. They wrote out a charm and told her to carry it with her, but Shui never returned. There was a rumor she had been seen in Paris or London, but the locals knew exactly where she was. She was gone to live with the fairies, who had whisked her away to some place of idle or sinful pleasure. Cardiff, perhaps? Oh, juicy. Jensu, welcome in. Awesome. Good to see you. So good. I think I'm going to call it there for the night, unless this is just extra tiny. It is extra tiny, so we're gonna do 6. When Buffalo Bill came to Aberystwyth. When Buffalo Bill came to Aberystwyth, in the early hours of 7 May 1904, a black steam train containing 20 carriages hauled by 2 engines pulled into Aberystwyth railway station. People gathered in the darkness. Excitement electrified the air, and rumors spread like a forest fire. A second train arrived, followed by a third, then silence. The people on board were fast asleep. Shortly before dawn, smoke mingled with early morning gull calls. A man in a tall hat climbed from the train, took out his pocket watch, looked around the expectant crowd, and raised his arm in the air. There was an intake of breath, and when he lowered his arm, every carriage door opened and out poured some 500 people, 180 horses, 18 bison, and a herd of Texan longhorns. For this was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Here to rob the Wells Fargo stagecoach, reenact the Battle of Greasy Grass, and recreate the myth of the Wild West on the Vicarage Field in the Wild West of Wales. They were embarking on a new tour of Britain, having spent much of the previous year roller coasting across Europe. In 6 months, 132 shows were planned, beginning in Stoke on 25 April and ending back in Staffordshire on the 21st of October. Each morning, they arrived in a new town, set up a performance space, presented an afternoon matinee, rolled up the tents, loaded the gear back on the carriages, and slept while the train trundled through the night to the next venue. They had played in Dolgellau the previous afternoon and traveled down overnight, passing through the stations at Tywin, Aberdyfi, and Mackinetheth. Balls. Mackineth. I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Dyfee Junction, Borth, and Bow Street, all of them shrouded in darkness. Aberystwyth, in the morning light, felt a long way from home, but they knew they could do this. They were American. The station emptied rapidly. Canvas was stretched across the nearby fields. Ropes were tied and knotted, scaffolding erected, and with the silent efficiency of experience, they built an arena that could accommodate 20,000, dressing rooms for the artists, stables for the broncos and draft horses, and a blacksmith shop, while the smell of char-grilled steaks filled the air. When the native people set up their teepee village, the whole effect was of a romantic Edward S. Curtis photograph. Later that morning, a procession poured down Great Darkgate Street. Schools were closed, pavements sardined with people, and children became overexcited. A wild horde of cowboys in tall hats rode down the hill from the clock tower, followed by natives in headdresses, some whooping and hollering, others looking distant and disinterested. There were sharpshooters, gauchos, cavalrymen, Cossacks, and Arabians, and the Deadwood stage, pulled by a piebald horse. A piebald horse? I'm not sure. There was a kerfuffle. The piebald fell to the ground, and the stagecoach shuddered to a halt. As the horse was freed from its harness and collar and helped to its feet, a small piece of painted wood broke off the shaft. An inquisitive little girl in a violet coat had been quietly watching, holding tightly to her grandfather's hand, but this was too much for her. She wrenched free of the old man's grasp and wiggled her way through the bodies. She ran towards the stagecoach. A woman screamed in the crowd. A cowboy raised his arm. His hand clutched a pistol, and a horse whinnied and reared. It all happened in slow motion. The girl ducked beneath the splintered shafts close to the horse's back hooves, snatched the piece of painted wood in her hand, and in the blink of a crow's eye, she melted through the crowd. She had a memento to remind her of the day Buffalo Bill came to Aberystwyth. At 2 o'clock prompt, the Star-Spangled Banner rang out. The cowboy band started to play, and never stopped all through the show. Buffalo Bill Cody appeared from at the tented arena in front of a packed crowd, dressed in buckskins and a Stetson, and riding a white stallion. The crowd watched intently. Farmers rubbed their shoulders with university professors. Shopkeepers with their families. Artists stood next to businessmen. All of them squeezed in like sheep in a pen. They were treated to an exhibition of trick riding, followed by the U.S. military firing artillery. And boy, were those cannon loud. There was sharpshooting from Cody's adopted son, Johnny Baker, who had replaced Annie Oakley the year before. There were bareback riders, the Pony Express, Russian Cossacks, a buffalo hunt, lasso displays worthy of Wonder Woman, an attack on a settler's cabin, the capture of the Deadwood stage with Cody himself holding the reins, and a reenactment of the Battle of Greasy Grass. Buffalo Bill himself on horseback fired his rifle at glass balls thrown in the air, and he never missed, not once. Johnny Baker shot between his legs while standing on his head, shattering glass balls and plunging holes in playing cards thrown in the air 90 feet away. They had stopped shooting live pigeons a few years before. It was messy and people complained, though they still used live ammunition. This was just another day to Buffalo Bill Cody. He was an entrepreneur who had once been a frontiersman. By the age of 15, he was riding for the Pony Express. In 1864, he was a scout for General Phil Sheridan, and 3 years later, he became a buffalo hunter for the Kansas Pacific Railroad, where he claimed to have shot over 4,000 in 2 years, hence his nickname. After the death of General Custer and the Battle of Greasy Grass in 1776, Cody hit upon the idea of touring an American variety show that would take the audience into the Wild West without fear of being shot, robbed, or stampeded by cattle. It would be a tribute act to frontiersmen, natives, and soldiers, rather like the bootleg Beatles, but with gun smoke instead of guitars. In 1885, he invented the Lakota Chief Tathanka Ayotaki, Sitting Bull, and a group of his warriors to play themselves in a reenactment of the Battle of Greasy Grass in which they had fought. Cody himself would play Custer and die a dramatic, drawn-out, and undeniably romantic death worthy of Lear or Nelson. Sitting Bull believed this may be a way to present the true nature of his people to a world that misunderstood and mistreated them. He was mistaken. During his first appearance, he rode once around the arena, was jeered and spat on, and cursed the audience beneath his breath. After 4 months, he quit and returned to the Standing Rock Reservation in North and South Dakota. He had been left with a sense of humiliation, a loss of dignity, and a feeling that there must be a better way forward for his people than being gawped at in gawped. Wow, I just that was gawked. Gawped with a P. Where are you at? Where's that word? Gawped at. Than being gawped at in what was little more than a freak show. He had heard of a new religion that was inspiring the people in the South and West, and it was not Christianity. It offered a celebration of life and respected their traditions, rejoined them with the ancestors, protected the wildlife they shared their lives with, and returned them to the land that had been taken from them. This was the ghost dance. One supporter of the ghost dance was Sitting Bull's nephew, Martho Wanataki, Kicking Bear. He was born an Oglala Sui around 1846, married woodpecker woman, daughter of the Lakota Chief, Unpahan Gleska, or Spotted Elk, and so became the chief in a Lakota nation. He fought alongside Sitting Bull at Greasy Grass, but he disagreed with his uncle's decision to work with Cody. In October 1889, Kicking Bear and his fellow Lakota, Thantaka Tekala, Tesela, or Short Bull, traveled to Nevada to learn the ghost dance from the movement's potty leader, Wovoka. The movement's, and this is somebody leader, Paiute leader, Wovaka. Within a year, the dance had spread across the western half of the United States. Native people were gathering, feeling empowered, and the government was becoming fearful. In October 1890, Kicking Bear visited his uncle in South Dakota. Shortly before Christmas, armed police were sent to remove Sitting Bull from the Standing Rock Reservation. A shot rang out, and another, and Sitting Bull lay dead. Shortly before New Year, the U.S. Army rode into the nearby Pine Ridge Reservation on Wounded Knee Creek and slaughtered up to 300 Lakota, including their leader, Spotted Elk, whose body was photographed lying frozen in the snow. Hundreds more were injured and arrested in one of the worst recorded mass shootings in American history. Kicking Bear was in prison in Fort Sheridan, Illinois, when Bill Cody came to visit and persuaded the authorities to commute his sentence, along with a group of 27 Lakota, in exchange for signing contracts committing them to tour in his Wild West show. A few months later, Cody returned to Britain and stayed for over 12 months, and this time he came to Wales, to Cardiff. He set up a teepee village in Sophia Gardens. Buffalo grazed on the grass in the park, and huge crowds thronged the roads to watch the parade go by. Cody stayed for 6 days. Nearly 130,000 people came to watch, and 10,000 lire changed hands. The romantic image of the Wild West that Cody presented that week shatters into shards of broken mirror with the realization that among the cast were men who had lost loved ones in the massacre at Wounded Knee, Kicking Bear, and Short Bull among them. Damn, Bean. Kicking Bear found this the most humiliating experience of his life, and after a year he returned to his people on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Wasu Maza, Iron Hale, known as Dewey Beard, worked with Cody for 15 years. He had killed a soldier at Greasy Grass as a 20-year-old and was shot twice in the back and once in the leg at Wounded Knee, where he watched his mother and brother, William, die, along with his father, Horncloud, and wife and baby son, Wet Feet. He became a film actor and native rights activist and lived at Pine Ridge until he was evicted from his home in 1942. when the Department of War annexed it for a bombing range. This shit is so fucked up. He was moved to a one-room shack in Rapid City, where he lived until 1955, the last surviving witness of greasy grass and wounded knee. In May 1904, Buffalo Bill returned to Wales. This time he ventured beyond Cardiff to Aberdare, Bangor, Ebu Vale, Llanelli, Rhyl, Raban, Llandudno, Porthmadog, Holyhead, Dal Jacanu, Caernarfon, Oswestry, Builth Wells, Barry Dock, Neath, Pembroke Dock, Carmarthen, and Swansea. He traveled by train, having signed an arrangement with Cambrian Railways that they would guarantee the safety of his animals. Cambrian Railways were quite used to carrying animals, and they frequently transported herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and elephants from traveling menageries. And so, on the evening of 6 May, they loaded their tents and teepees, horses and buffalo, artillery and stagecoaches back onto the 3 black trains at Aberystwyth station and set off towards Oswestry. Their thoughts must have been elsewhere, for a month earlier, a mail train had crashed into the back of the Oregon Express in Chicago after it stopped at a signal in thick fog. 23 Lakota from Pine Lake were in the rear carriage, on their way to join the Wild West show in Wales. There were terrible injuries, and Chief Whitehouse and 5 more died, and the Lakota mourned their dead once more. Many memories remain of the day Buffalo Bill came to Aberystwyth. There are 3 misty photographs that show U.S. artillery being hauled around the arena, and a mustachioed cowboy on horseback with Penn Dinas in the background. Another photo was taken a few days before of 2 unnamed Lakota in hospital in Llandudno, with 3 nurses standing between their beds. An Indian figure stands on the pavement on Terrace Road, chained to Lloyd's tobacconists, a reminder of the crude stereotyping of Native people. A headdressed Native portrait of Tatanka Iyotaki is painted on the side of the shooting gallery in the traveling fairground that visits every November, and a piece of broken painted wood rescued from the deadwood sage was kept in a house in Llanbadarn, Fawr, and another memory lies beneath the water. On the site of the old vicarage field, where Buffalo Bill pitched his tents, just next to the children's playground in the park, there is a small swamp with coppiced and pollarded adders. Every winter, this little piece of land floods. The trees go paddling, dogs splash and sniff, and there are siskin and redpaw, ducks and kingfishers, and once a white egret. It's a memory of the Rialto floodplain, before the industrial estates, tax office, cheap food shops, car parks, storage depots, concrete, cement, and traffic smells. In the summer, it is a coiffured municipal lawn. But once a year, it is a looking glass, a mirror, a reflection of those who walked this village before, a glimpse of an other world. Listen. There are voices still speaking from forgotten, shared past. Wow, that was heavy. Here's a picture of the buffalo. Dang, you guys. I'm starting to sweat it out pretty hardcore, and that's where I'm going to call it tonight. So happy new moon. Yeah. I will see you sooner than later. Here comes Friday and the weekend. So I love yous. Thanks for hanging out. Mwah. I'll see you so soon. Thank you. Take care.